looks like we're moving on to week 2 of the mystery quilt, and this is Dresden 2 of our doilies and Dresden's design. And as you can see on the instructions, which you should have printed by now so you can follow along, this is where Dresden 2 is going to be placed in our mystery quilt. This is what one block looks like. And here, if you were to repeat Dresden 2, that is just one of the very many layout options that you could use. There's an electric quilt file in there. It has a file extension of .pj6. I'm sorry, .pj7. So if you see that, you'll know that that is electric quilt 7 file that you can use to maybe do other different layouts in there. So I think you will enjoy playing with that. This is our first page. Our page 2 is a very important page that shows you how to take the yardage that you purchase for mystery quilt and what fabric goes where. Now in our videos we are doing all different colors just so you can see kind of a variety of different colorways. What we've done here, this is our sample that we used was in these colors, and we'll show you pictures of that probably in week 6. But all of our pictures that we put here on our step-by-step instructions will follow the fabric and thread colors of what we did in our samples. So I don't want to confuse you, but a lot of people just kind of like different ideas on what they can do with different colorways. So what we suggest that you do is when you purchase your fabric on your fabric and thread key paper, not these are the instructions, but you can put your fabric swatches on there so that when you get home you remember which piece of fabric was for which fabric number. So here we're going to do a patriotic theme with this particular one. I have no idea what this is going to look like, and we're going to have a darker background, and most of the ones I've done have all had a lighter background, so it'll be interesting to see how this comes out. And again, I've taken my thread colors down here. I've written down what my thread choices are, and your thread colors you're going to try and match, and if you have a print, just pick one of the colors out of the print. For instance, we have red, white, and blue here, so you can make that either red, white, or blue thread. Doesn't matter, but write down the thread choices there. If you're using solids, go ahead and match your thread to what your solids are. So here's what I've done is I have circled, we're going to do a 6-inch block for this video. So I've circled so that I don't end up cutting out the wrong size fabric. It makes it a little bit easier to follow. We are going to use our optional wool batting in this one. So what you're going to start out with is hooping your battleizer, which we've done. It's going to begin the block by stitching a placement stitch. We're going to then layer wool batting on top, which is an optional step. We'll talk about that more when we get there. And then the fabric in that we'll need, and I'll lay this here so you can see how it matches. Our fabric 1 is this, and our thread A is our pillow blue, and we're going to have that with a matching bobbin. Our thread 2 is this red paisley, and we are using white, and we need a matching bobbin for that. Fabric 3 is this fabric, and thread C is our blue, and that's the only one we don't need a matching bobbin for in this particular block. And then fabric 4 is this red paisley, and our thread D is Carolina red, and there we need a matching bobbin for it. Our backing and background fabric I've made the same color, and that would be these. We also need a strip of our background fabric. So there's those two. Our quilting thread is going to be this, what is it called? It is called Royal, and we also need a matching bobbin for that, and you're also going to need some water-soluble thread. We recommend the Vanish Light from Superior Threads, and that's what we're going to use for various different steps, and as we use them I'll explain to you why we do that. So let me get my machine threaded and we'll get ready for step number 1. Okay, for step 1 we have our battleizer in the hoop, embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and just a neutral color thread in the needle, and the machine is going to stitch a placement stitch. Our placement stitch is completed for step 2. This is the optional step where you can choose to add the wool batting if you want to. It is not necessary, but we think it really adds a lot of dimension to your quilt blocks. So I have water-soluble thread in the needle, And I'm going to go ahead and the machine will sew a zigzag stitch around the edge. And by the way, the edge, again, like we mentioned in the first video, in case you didn't see it, is that we have pressed the edges in with an iron and a pressing cloth, just maybe about 1/4 of an inch in, and that will help the presser foot from getting caught in the batting. Step 3, I'm going to take my background fabric and I'm going to center it over the wool batting or over the placement stitch if you decide to pass on the wool batting. And with water-soluble thread, we're going to just sew a basting stitch to hold that to the battleizer. For step 4, I place thread A, which is my light pillow blue thread, in the needle only. We still have the embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and we're going to sew a cross stitch. Now that I have the cross stitch part of it done, we are on step number 5, and I am putting water soluble thread in the needle, and it's going to sew a placement stitch. And for step number 6, I'm going to leave the water soluble thread where it is. And I'm going to place, this is fabric 1, I'm going to place it. I do have a little bit of selvage there, so I do need to be careful, but I'm going to place it. Let me bring this out so it's easier to see. I want my fabric to extend 1/4 of an inch past that basting stitch and about 1/4 of an inch down here too, so I'm just going to place it like that. You can peek under just to make sure it looks good. So let's put it back in there and we will sew our basting stitch. If you noticed when it sewed the basting stitch or the tack down stitch, it did it twice here, and that's because we are going to be cutting that close for applique. The rest of it looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and cut off my selvage. And then we can go on to step 7. For step 7, I believe we probably don't want to use our water-soluble thread anymore. So we're going to just change to a neutral thread. I'm just going to put the light blue thread in there. You can choose one of your embroidery threads that you're using. And we had some background fabric, the darker blue, that we had a strip of that cut. And of course the strip's going to vary upon what size block you're using, but that is going to be the next fabric that we're going to be using. And again, I still have the selvage cut into this piece, so I'll make sure that you can either cut it off, I'll just cut it off, but just make sure that you don't sew the selvage into the block. You're going to lay it right side down, raw edges even. Do I need to pull that out? Let's do it just so you can see. So right sides down, raw edges even with this. And we're going to go ahead with our neutral thread and we're going to sew a seam. Step 8, we're going to go ahead and flip this fabric right side up, and the machine will sew a tack down stitch. And we will continue with the regular thread in there, the neutral thread. I'm going to finger press this a little bit. And then again, we're going to trim it. Leave about 1/8 of an inch in this area, about 1/4 of an inch like you would for a seam, and then trim close to stitching on the top edge of your Dresden plate. Step 9, we're going to be using the fabric 1 again, laying that right sides down, raw edges even. And continuing with neutral thread, we're going to stitch another seam. I'm going to flip this and stitch another tack down stitch for step 10. Again, we're going to trim it and 1/8 of an inch there, 1/4 of an inch there, and right up to the stitching on the top part. Now I will tell you, I did have kind of a generous seam, so I came really close to the edge there, but it should be just fine because our seam is going to come in a little bit further anyway. So if that happens to you, don't worry about it. And then step 11, we're going to place our fabric 2, which for me is the red, right sides down just like we have been. Going to stitch a seam, still using the neutral thread. Never want to use water soluble for a seam. Step 12, you're going to flip it right sides up, finger press, and sew the tack down stitch still with the neutral thread. The next 2 fabrics we're going to add will be another strip of the background fabric and then another strip of the red fabric, which for me was the fabric 2. Now it is time to change our thread back to water soluble thread, and we're doing this because it's on the edge of the block, and that way when you sew the blocks together, if that tack down stitch happens to show, you won't have to rip it out with a seam ripper because it will just wash away. Thus the name washable thread, or wash away thread, water soluble thread. Our basement flooded one time when my sewing room was down in the basement, and floating in the flood was a spool of all gummed up water soluble thread. Needless to say, I needed to replace it. Last one, we're trimming right up to the stitching at the top, trimming about 1/8 of an inch down in the center circle area. This we can just leave there. For step 23, we're going to need thread C, which is thread C for me is this blue color, so we'll go ahead and put this in the needle, and it's going to stitch a decorative stitch around the curved edge of the Dresden 2. And since we don't have our backing fabric on, we are still using our embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. For step 24, I have thread B and the needle only, and we're going to sew a satin cover stitch. For step 25, I put water-soluble thread in the needle, and this is my fabric 4 down in the lower right-hand corner. I'm going to make sure that I have the sides. I'm going to do a little peekaboo underneath, make sure it's fully covered. I want as much fabric as I can hanging over the outside edges, and we're going to sew a tack down stitch. Okay, we're going to trim this block or this section off now. We're going to leave the fabric on the outside edge where it is, and we're going to trim the curved edge inside the block right up close to the stitching. Now we're doing step 26, and I have thread C and the needle only, and it's going to sew some embroidery. For step 27, I have thread B and the needle only, and we're going to sew more embroidery. For step 28, we're going to put thread A in the needle only and sew more embroidery. For step 29, I have thread D and the needle only, and we're going to sew the satin cover stitches. Okay, we have completed 29 steps. We're on step 30, and this is what it looks like so far. Step 30, it's time to add our backing fabric to the back of the hoop. And if you happen to have a directional fabric, I just want to remind you, I thought about it because this is a very small print, but it is directional. So you have to keep in mind that you will be rotating some of the blocks to make like a 4 square. So you'll need to be very careful that you get your direction of your fabric right if you have directional fabric. What I'm going to do to help this stick, and this is an option, you don't necessarily have to do it, but over my trash can I just sprayed the back of my backing fabric with KK 2000. And I'm centering that, peeking under, make sure I have this centered very nicely over the block. Don't press too hard because you don't want anything to come loose or your quilting is going to be off. I put water-soluble thread, or I will, I haven't yet, but I'm going to put water-soluble thread and then needle only. And then the machine is going to sew a basting stitch to hold the backing fabric on. One thing you're going to want to do is just kind of peek under, make sure that that backing fabric did not come off and get flipped over. Okay, this is our backing fabric that's been sewn on with a basting stitch. And then for step 31, we're going to put thread A in the needle and in the bobbin. At this point, we have our backing fabric on, so until we finish the block, we're going to want our bobbin thread to be matching our needle thread. And another thing you need to remember to do is to do a needle down and a needle up to bring the bobbin thread to the top. And if you have an automatic thread cutter on your machine and it's turned on, this would be a good time to turn it off. By doing those steps, you'll make for a much nicer, neater, prettier looking back to your block. So, ready for step 31 with thread A in the needle and the bobbin. And just to reiterate what I just said, do a needle down, needle up, pull the bobbin thread to the top, and then you can begin sewing. And then you're going to want, as it Does a few stitches, go ahead, stop the machine so you can cut that thread tail. And then it's going to sew some quilting stitches. For step 32, I have thread D, which is red for me, and the needle and the bobbin. Needle down, needle up, pull your bobbin thread to the top and begin stitching. And now step 33, I have thread B and the needle and the bobbin. It's going to do some decorative stitches. Whoops, not paying attention to what I'm doing. This is thread B and the needle and the bobbin. Step 34, we're going to put our quilting thread in the needle and the bobbin. We're going to do a needle down, needle up, bring your quilting thread to the top and begin sewing. Alright, so we finished our Dresden 2 and we already filmed our Dresden 1. And you can see I got a 5-inch block and a 6-inch block. So are you kind of getting an idea of what this might look like completed? I know it's called Doilies in Dresden, so we have like a little doily action going on with the quilting in the background. Hard to see on the blue one. But just wondered if anyone has figured out what else is going on in the background. So I hope you enjoy it and watch the next video for Dresden 3.